back to the Valley to Peak Nutrition Podcast. This is the second episode in our series with Dr. Brent Ruby. If you didn't catch the first episode, I'd encourage you to press pause on this one, go check that out, and then come back here once you finish. In this episode, we tackle an entirely different topic. We look at the topic of training. We look at things like the arduous pack test, which is what the Forest Service uses to test men and women in their ability to be a wildland firefighter. We look at what that pack test can teach us about our own training for the outdoors. And then we look at how simple training is and can be. A couple of really, really, really simple and practical things for you to watch as spring and summer ramp up and you start to think about how you're going to train for things that you may have planned this summer or this fall. Plus, we cover a host of other topics. I've linked Brent's first episode, an article that we're using to accompany this series, and I've also linked any other resources that we have mentioned through this series in the show notes. So go check those out if you're interested. Here's Dr. Brent and I looking at training for the outdoors and just how simple it can actually be. Can you give just kind of a brief reintroduction of who you are, and then we'll dive in?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Brent Ruby. I'm a research professor at the University of Montana, and I coordinate a research center on campus, on the Missoula campus. Go Grizz! I only say that because we're going to the national championship, which is killer. They've been to the championship a number of times. They've only won it in my 30 years at the U, but I coordinate a research center called the Montana Center for Work Physiology and Exercise Metabolism. And this is my 30th year at the university. So I've seen a lot of change. I've seen a lot of development, and I've seen a lot of the same things. But my research focus is on what humans can manage, what humans can do in austere environments. And that means cold, hot, high altitude, or just ultra endurance, aggressive, big human play or work.
Yeah, that's great. It's a very good description as to kind of what you had done. And for anybody that's listening to this episode, we've done 2 now with Brent, and you can go back and listen to the first one where we cover a ton of stuff about physiology. The intent of this one, which I think will appeal to a lot of the folks who listen to this podcast, is the work and the research that you've done around what the Wildland Fire Service calls the arduous pack test, which is, from my understanding, kind of the gold standard for someone that's interested in being a wildland firefighter. Can you walk us through what that is and what the benchmarks are for someone who wants to do something like that?
Yeah, no doubt. First note, if you don't like the pack test, don't blame me. I didn't develop it. I came to the university in 1994. There was no internet, and Brian Sharkey was retired from the U and was working with the Forest Service. In that time, right around that time, actually before I got there, they had done some of the basic data collection to look at what combinations of load carriage and walking speeds would elicit an oxygen consumption of a certain level. That certain level being the estimated values that fire crews navigate to or work at on the fire line when they're hiking, when they're digging line, those sorts of things. And some of that data collection goes back to the 60s, the 1960s, when Brian did some data collection, just simulated. Just here's a Pulaski, hit the ground at a speed that's similar to what you work at. Here's a pack, carry it. Let's collect a bag of gas, expired air, and we'll analyze it. And so he put all those pieces together, very, very simple, but came up with the metabolic load that is this measure of oxygen consumption, which back in the 60s, really hard to do those analyses. Now it's virtually automated, and if you have a nice system, it's pretty simple to collect those data. It's a little bit more difficult to collect them outside of the lab when you're not tethered to the machine, which is pretty bench top heavy. But they do make portable systems that are expensive and easy to break and hard to calibrate. But if they work, you can use those in the field. And so Brian's original thought was that because this metabolic measure that he kept coming up with, which that number, we'll just put a number to it, that number was approximately 22 and a half. That is in units of measure that oxygen consumption is expressed in, which is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body weight per minute. You don't need to get down in those weeds. But based on that measure, Brian thought, okay, well, if that's the average oxygen consumption of most of the tasks, then humans are going to have a really hard time working at that level if their maximal ability to consume oxygen is not at least double that. So when we do these long, big tasks, we might sustain loads of about 50% of our maximum capacity. So all he did was simply double that value, come up with an estimate of what a firefighter needs as far as a peak VO2, and said it's 45. And so they developed the pack test intensity around that metabolic load of 22 and a half. So when you put on a 45-pound pack and you walk at 4 miles an hour on a flat course, if we were to swoop in, collect a bag of gas, or connect you to a metabolic system, the average oxygen consumption would be around 22 and a half. There's going to be some variability in that, but it basically just attempts to get at, can you sustain that work rate for 45 minutes? If you can do that, if you can easily do that, and the key word is easily do that, it should not be hard. If it is hard, then the job is going to be hard. If you're on the line hotshot or other on the line fire crew member, but if you're a safety officer, it's probably going to be hard because you don't do that kind of work necessarily.
So basically, it's a test that was designed to be standardized based on research that said, if you do this much effort or intensity and want to do this job, this is kind of the benchmark to see if this person can achieve that, right? Like this should elicit the type of response that we saw in the data. And if they can achieve the result, then that is what's going to be the outcome. What are some of the benchmarks? Like if I were to say, like, let's say I'm interested in doing wildland firefighting and I knew that I needed to get ready for this test. Do you know off the top of your head what some of those benchmarks are as far as how much weight a person has to carry or over, what amount of mileage or terrain is required of that?
That's a good question. I'd have to look up a paper. We did a paper. I helped with a paper that one of the U.S. Forest Service physiology team members did. His name's Joe Saul. He was also one of our doctoral students that just finished this last spring, which is cool. But Joe did a study where he used GPS monitors to look at changes in terrain, speed and grade of travel, and then he collected data on how heavy the pack and the gear weight was. And in the vast majority of the crew members, the equipment weight was a little bit less than 30 pounds on average. And that's with like 130 subjects. Not much difference between the men and the women, except that the women ended up carrying a little bit more weight relative to their body mass. But that's the thing. I mean, you can measure the pack weight on one crew member and it might be 25. You look at somebody like a sawyer and they've got to carry the saw and their pack and the fuel and all that. They may carry 60. So, but it's hard to put it into one size fits all.
So I was looking it up while you were talking, and it looks like to pass, unless I'm interpreting this wrong, to pass the arduous pack test, you've got to do a 3-mile hike with 45 pounds in 45 minutes or less. On the United States Forest Service developed a, call it a training guide of sorts, right? Like, so let's just continue with this idea that I'm the guy that's interested. So a guy like me goes on, starts researching this, and you pull up this trifold pamphlet that the United States Forest Service has developed, and it looks quite old. In fact, I think the copyright on it's from 97. And so here's what they suggest in terms of preparing for this. So if kudos to them for recognizing not everyone's going to roll out of bed ready to do this. And so we want to give them some sort of a resource to prepare them. Here's the kind of the preparation they say. 4 weeks before the actual test itself, hike for 3 miles on flat ground, no pack at all. Once you can do that in 45 minutes, add 25 pounds to the pack, repeat again. Increase the weight in the pack until you reach 45 pounds and can do that in 45 minutes or less. Mm-hmm. This is probably extremely challenging to answer, but is that simple method a good way for all of us to train if we're interested in doing something in a mountainous terrain, carrying some sort of a load?
Oh boy. Well, I think that the temptation, there's a lot of temptation from, I suppose, today's strength and conditioning generation to try to make that message considerably sexier. Because there is nothing less sexy than a trifold information brochure that provides the very generic basic. But when you boil down all the flashy, CSCS, tactical strength and conditioning mantra, if you strip all that away, what you're going to be left with is those same basic nuts and bolts. And so you can't, it'd be nice if the message was a little bit more palatable, I suppose, than it is in that brochure. But in terms of the bottom line message, there's nothing wrong with that message. And so if somebody were to approach it with that sort of a strategy, assuming they haven't done hardly any physical activity, if that's the case, then they need to back up way farther than just start walking 3 miles on flat ground. But that's not a bad strategy in terms of planned progression. There's nothing magical about that speed and that pack load, except for the fact that that's the combination that was done over and over on the treadmill in whenever the early 90s, when they developed that test, or when they developed that data set. It's frustrating to me that that's not in a journal somewhere and it's just in a brochure. That's kind of surprising. Like, it really needs to be in the Medicine, Science, Sport, and Exercise, or the Journal of Applied Physiology, or whatever, one of those journals, so that it's defensible. It's hard when it's only in a brochure, but I don't see anything wrong with that process. If somebody's not used to carrying a pack, and then let's say they're a runner, they're going to have a huge advantage in terms of getting started. But the difference between training for the test versus training for the job is, on the job, the hiking speed with even a modest load is not going to be that fast. There's no way someone's going to hike 4 miles an hour up and down and around difficult terrain. The only reason for that speed is that combination, the load and the speed, resulted in the VO2, or the metabolic load, that was desired to hit. So,
well, and I think too, you are right. For some reason, it seems like we want things to be harder than they've got to be. Almost like that validates our effort, or I don't really know, but I mean, it is the coup de grace of training is progressive overload, and that is a simple way to do it, right? It's like, I mean, that is basically what they're saying there. So you had mentioned something just a second ago that I'd be curious about, because there is this debate among, I would say, the mountaineering community, and definitely the, quote, backcountry hunting, hiking community, that we can just run, right? Skip the pack piece of things. If I want to improve my overall endurance, I can do that just running. Is there value in having that as a part of a training plan if the modality that you're planning to do is to carry a pack over mountainous terrain for, let's call it 6-7 days, consecutively?
The short answer is hell no. I mean, I've been a runner my whole life, and I was a good runner here and there at different times. And the reason I was a good runner was not because I carried a pack. The reason I was a decent 5K runner and other was because I ran. Because the other critical training pillar that often gets just kicked aside for whatever reason is specificity. That's like saying to become a really good triathlete, you're not just a swimmer or a water polo player. You have to put in the time in the saddle, and you got to put in the time running. And none of that stuff at the end of the day moves across those sports. So good for you if you're swimming your ass off. That's not going to do anything for your running. Nothing. Unless you're talking ground zero, I need to just bring my maximal oxygen consumption above playing video games on the couch. Then there is some transition across modalities. But training specificity is a huge, huge thing. And if you take somebody that's just an avid runner, they're going to be great at running. But as soon as the job shifts and now they got to carry a pack, different world. They've got a nice foundation as far as a nice aerobic foundation, but carrying a pack alters the energy systems that are necessary to do the job. And it also greatly alters what muscle fibers are being recruited. So will they have an advantage in making progress towards the end goal? Absolutely. But if all they did was run and never put on a pack and think I'll be good, it just pisses in the face of specificity, and that's not cool.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the other major training component is exactly like you said, specificity. So as you were talking, I was just sitting here nodding because I agree 100%. And I think that the important thing to remember is anytime you add an external variable that makes it harder, but your body's not used to that, that's going to increase the intensity for you. And if it's not been exposed to that, it's going to be a new challenge. Like, for example, nearly anyone could get on a treadmill and walk at 1 to 2 miles an hour. But if I were to be standing next to you and I take the incline from 0 to 15%, you could be in the best shape of your life, but you will be working harder, and you'll all of a sudden notice, what seemed so simple and like anyone could do it now becomes a great challenge. And if we were to put some sort of a heart rate monitor on you or something, it would show that it was a greater challenge. Even if you're not huffing and puffing, you'd certainly go from being at, call it 75 beats a minute to 100 at the bare minimum. And the pack is the same. If you can run all day, it doesn't mean that you're in poor condition, but you may not be in pack mountain type condition.
Yeah. It's different being a quick 5K runner, or now this day and age, it seems like everybody and their grandma is a trail runner. Fascinating, which means the sale of those tactical running vests has gone off the charts. There's a big difference between running fast or running on a trail and then carrying a load and moving at a slower rate of travel, but up and down and around and are difficult terrain. It's not none of this stuff is a grooved packed gravel trail or a nice track.
Yeah. So going back to what you'd mentioned about someone being on a team or being a Sawyer or whatever, and not necessarily hiking at that 4 mile an hour standard that they suggest about, certain pack tests. Is there any value in training in a specific heart rate zone? Or would it be better to not be so concerned about what zone you're in, as opposed to carrying the weight of a pack, that allows you to move at a pace that makes you feel like you're doing something, but not necessarily so fast that you wind up burning yourself out in 20 minutes.
Absolutely. That is absolutely essential. I mean, I don't understand. Well, I do understand it as a runner. It seemed like as a younger runner, every time you go out for a run, you want it to mean something and you want it to feel a certain way. And you want to have that sort of fatigued satisfaction at the end of the event or the end of the training session. And that mentality needs to fade into the background, because training progression is a combination of smartly inserted higher intensity sessions interwoven strategically into mostly lower intensity training sessions. So put on a lighter pack, carry it across the hills, but do it at a pace that you can manage for 3 hours. And then as you do that, then start to add in higher intensity scenarios, maybe sometimes with the pack. Just if you're in the middle of a 1 hour training session and you're walking through the hills and there's a little uptick in grade, go a little bit faster up that hill. You'll feel it. The RPE will signal that you're going harder. You don't need to monitor that with heart rate. We really want to develop an app that would provide users, if they put their basic information in it, like their weight and the weight that they're carrying, and then hit go, and it would track their progress across a hike. Let's say it was a varied, let's just say it was a completely uphill hike. So it was going to be 30 minutes of gradual uphill. Based on the speed of travel, the terrain factor, which they would need to put in, is it crushed gravel? Is it asphalt? Is it whatever? If you put that stuff into the equation, and it's got speed of travel and percent grade, load carried, and your body weight, we would be able to estimate the VO2 of that task pretty darn well. And then if a person adds heart rate to the mix, then we could really get in it, do some simple calculations and figure out, okay, what percentage of their maximal effort are they likely working at? And then it provides a sense of readiness feedback to that individual. Then they're not just completely working in the blind. They've got some feedback that says, hey, don't worry about it. This training effort is adequate, and it's got you on the right pay or on the right schedule. So those are things that we're trying to work out. But
going back to what you had mentioned about strategically weaving in higher intensity efforts, is there, not even, I don't even want to say is there a standard like by the book recommendation, but when you said insert it smartly, what would that look like? Are we talking about inserting one session every week? Are we talking about, like you had mentioned, where you're in the middle of a 1 or 2 hour training session and you just happen to maybe insert it for 1 minute over that 1 hour, and you're doing it what seems like less planned but more frequently? Is there a good, better, best scenario for something like that?
In general, if you the sort of this 80% low intensity, 20% higher intensity is sort of a good recommendation. That's been developed mostly from looking at peeling away the layers of what elite athletes end up doing and migrating to, and staying successful at their training and their quest for medals, I suppose. So when you look at some of that training data, sort of this 80-20 rule surfaces over and over. And that is really hard for the average person to get into their head, because when they go out to train, most often they run. If they're a runner, running's the easiest one to sort of break apart, is they run at a certain speed, and they reach that speed and they just try to maintain that for the whole run. And they do that day in and day out and day in and day out. and they wonder why they don't get much better than that intensity, is because they don't live anywhere above that. So if you were to, and that's also, that intensity is sort of no man's land as far as eliciting a training intensity. The only thing it does is when you live at or near that intensity, when you finish the training session, there's a chest thumping satisfaction that you have that suggests, oh yeah, I just banged that out. Right on. Did anyone see that? No. But I'll upload it to Strava, they will. And then if I saw their Strava, I'd be like, why are you training only at one intensity over and over and freaking over? So what they need to do is say 80% of their training, let's say that line is right here. 80% of their training needs to be below that, well below that, which is not as mentally satisfying. But you build that giant volume low below that threshold, and then every 2-3 days, whatever, there are designated training sessions where you live above that intensity for windows at time. Maybe that's 10 by 1 minute, 10 by 2 minutes, above, just a little bit above that threshold. And that's what moves that line up. And that's what allows you to sustain higher and higher aerobic intensities as you graduate down the path of training.
Yeah, I think that there's so many great nuggets in that as far as the 80-20 principle and the, like, we want this feeling, but really, like, and I mentioned this to someone just the other day, never have I seen greater progress doing less than when I started having an actual training program written. Yeah. Right. Whereas before it was just kind of like, oh, okay, well, I'll just go out and do the thing for a certain amount of time. And you're out there like for periods where you're just smoking yourself, and then you're trying to recover, and you get back to the truck and you think, oh man, that was so effective. And all of the while, now hindsight being 2020, I was doing nothing but wearing myself out, and it is so counterintuitive, but it is true. What about the strength training effect of this? Not necessarily thinking about, let's just blanket it, even though it's a very bad terminology. It's one that people will be most familiar with under cardio. What about strength training, doing weightlifting? And you could call that something simple like squats or anything that you can think of on that end. What value, if any, is there towards contributing and being a better hiker, backpacker, doing the pack test or what have you?
Yeah, that's something that has been out of our wheelhouse since day one. It's really difficult outside of measuring what sort of weight that they're carrying on the line. It's really difficult to build some sort of a evidence-based document that says, here's what crew members need to be able to do or tolerate in the weight room, because it's not as simple as counting calories, total calories, or measuring VO2. That's much more objective. The other is far more subjective. And I think that the beauty of sort of the really good and creative strength and conditioning professionals is that they can look at a job task, or they could do sort of a job task analysis. They can critically look at the data that's been collected at different time points in the season, maybe before the season and after the season, and they could sort of establish a line in the sand. If we say that the metabolic load averages 22.5, okay, now they have some semblance of what the aerobic load tolerance needs to be. And that, by the way, should probably be as high as 35. Okay, they've got that. They've tucked that into their arsenal. Then the only thing out there is data on how many pull-ups, push-ups, or sit-ups are firefighters typically showing up on day one. And more importantly, I think, what are they able to do at the end of the season? what they are able to do at the end of the season after they've gone through the entire season, that is far more telling, because that's going to be a signature or a function of what they did all season long. So, and there's very little data on that. There's, I think, one paper from a group at Colorado State that looked at, say, pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, and maybe mile and a half run times. But if a gifted strength and conditioning person had those data, had that evidence-based information, then they could develop a pretty comprehensive plan. They just have to realize that not every firehouse or not every station or where these crews are based, most of them hardly have any facilities. So they might have a pull-up bar. They can obviously do push-ups. If they have any resistance training gear, it looks like a high school gym at best. And so it becomes challenging to make a one size fits all across the agency, because the facilities are so hit and miss.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems to me like a bench pull up and sit up test isn't necessarily measuring anything. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's a measure of anything that's actually useful. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. You would think that in my mind's eye, what would almost be better would be some sort of a protocol or something similar that elicits injury prevention, right? So doing something where it's strengthening the hips, like a hip hinge type movements with a deadlift, for example, setting a standard for that because it strengthens the hip, which reduces injury and allows you to go all season, carry loads heavier, etc. But I didn't know if there was something out there like that for that.
There's not a uniform thing, and I've never really, that's outside of my but I'll definitely admit that is well outside of my wheelhouse. And so it would be really unique to sit down with a really strong strength and conditioning person that has done some stuff with tactical operators or other, that has a background. The thing that bothers me the most is when it doesn't have to be a strength and conditioning person that certainly is violated left and right by folks in sport nutrition, is they just see a picture of a young man or a young woman. There's fire in the background. They're wearing boots, a helmet, carrying a pack, and they're in their green and yellow. And that's all the information they have, is that picture. Then their mind runs amok, and they think that they have the perfect strategy to feed that person and to train that person, knowing nothing about what the job entails. And that's the thing that frustrates the crap out of me, is that after having put nearly 30 years of research, virtually my entire career at Montana, chasing these crews and accidentally dedicating my whole career to that study, it drives me insane that somebody says, "Oh, I've got the perfect feeding strategy for firefighters." It's like, do you know what Nomex smells like on the fire line? Have you ever eaten in a fire camp? Have you been on the line? Have you hiked with a crew? Have you been around them? Have you asked them what their problems are? The vast majority of those folks can say no. But I think it'd be amazingly informative to put a group of people in a room that was some well-experienced crew members, me and like some strength and conditioning folks, people that are so gifted at being able to develop creative, practical training programs. If you put those people in the same room, you could come up with a pretty damn good consensus statement or position stand on how to train a wildland firefighter. And the best part would be all the back and forth and the debate and the just sort of the discussion. But the person that, I mean, scientists are famous for not involving the end user in their discussions of what to study and how to study and what the frick it means. And that's a difference with all the work we've done with fire crews. Is I've been adamant about making sure they're in the same room and in the same on the same level of our discussions. The last thing I want to do is or see is a scientist saying that they figured it all out without really fully knowing what the job is. That's just not fair. I mean, scientists are famous for making mistakes, but that's one of the most egregious mistakes you can make, which is the mistake that your data is fully generalizable when it is absolutely not.
So speaking about that and talking about the end user, talking about these folks, and also taking in, to consideration the type of folks that listen to this podcast doing similar stuff like that, albeit not on a fire line. I know it's different. When is it too much, both from training or during the workload? And so one of the phrases that you use in the study, which is great, it's rhabdomyolysis, which is common terminology to a lot of folks. Some people are unfamiliar with it. You can touch on what it is if you want to give a brief description, but I'm curious at what point do you start to notice we've carried it overboard? A person's become either too aggressive in their training, or for these folks, the job requirements are so challenging that they develop this condition. Is there a tangible point or something we could do preventatively to avoid? And I recognize rhabdos, you'd have to really do something pretty dramatic in your training to elicit that. But yeah, curious your thoughts.
I think with rhabdomyolysis, the military has studied it in depth, and they have a military health and surveillance monthly report that comes out, and annually they have their rhabdo follow-up, and that is a publicly available journal article. It boils down the last 5 years, and it just has been rolling for several years. But it says what are the candidates within the military that are most likely to get it? How does it present itself? And so on. And it provides some numbers, which is it's just a descriptive sort of review of these clinical cases. But the clinical teams that have been really interested in that within the military, I think we can learn a lot from those findings and superimpose that onto the world of fire. What seems to be interesting with rhabdo is it's really hard to get that when you're training by yourself, because the vast majority of times or situations when that crops up as an endpoint or a clinical condition is when a group is pushing or being pushed towards some common goal that is enormously aggressive. Best example is those burnout sessions, over and over and over. Okay, we showed up on day one of critical training, and after everyone got done shaking each other's hands, we ran for a mile, and then we came back to the station, and then there was pull-up bars, and everybody had to do as many pull-ups as they could do in 1 minute. Then they were given 5 minutes rest, and then we had to do it again and again and again. And that was interspersed with burnout sessions of push-ups. And it just becomes this ridiculous ego crunching match that is trying to separate this group from that group. And when those burnout sessions are put in place, that's rhabdo is an absolute risk, because they're not used to that intensity of especially upper body assault type training.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because whenever I hear that word, I think of the early days of CrossFit, right? So when CrossFit was starting to gain a lot of popularity and all of a sudden became kind of this open forum for people to join, there was a lot of cases of rhabdo. So it's interesting to hear that it was, you see that in this group population. Now, I'm not saying that's still the case. I'm not saying that that's always the case. I'm just saying in the early days, you had a lot of that, kind of popping up. And it's interesting because when I worked in the hospital, we would get people admitted on occasion from rhabdo and sometimes from exercise. and you can see in the blood there's a certain marker that rises pretty dramatically when there's that type of an insult to the muscle. But I think well, I personally, and I think others will be comforted to know that there's probably a very low likelihood in your own training that you're going to go too hard. What is more likely is you're probably going to try to ramp it up too hard over an extended period of time and risk some sort of musculoskeletal injury or something like that, right? Like you get shin splints that won't go away, or you get a nagging hip pain because it's just too much too fast. Any suggestions on ramping up, right? And maybe some of this is too nuanced. Maybe it's just like, yeah, just go and then occasionally add a little bit more to the pack and then do the same distance at the same time, and then give yourself a couple more weeks and then add a little bit more. And if that's the case, I think people would be comforted to know that it is that simple.
Yeah, I think it's that simple. I think that with rhabdo, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's almost impossible for a person to develop rhabdo by themselves. It's when they're in a group training session, when everybody wants to measure themselves against somebody else. CrossFit is famous for that, but preseason critical training is famous for that. Some of these crews don't know each other, and of course there's the rookie or the rookies, and they need to stack up to whatever the experienced crew members want them to. And to expect them to do that on day one is dangerous, and it's not responsible. And I just don't think there's room for that. In a lot of people might say, "Oh, you're just being a baby. You're being too conservative." And it's like, at the end of the day, all 20 people on that crew are a family, and it's like the goal should be to help foster that training as a group, because not one person digs the line, everybody does. And the way that people adapt over the course of the season, they show up as this ragtag, widespread, high fitness level, low fitness level, and everything in between. And at the end of the season, they're one unit of worker bees that are enormously gifted at working together. And so even the measures of oxygen consumption that we can do in the lab, you can show how widespread they are at the beginning of the season, how tight knit they are at the end of the season, because they just come together so tightly. That study's really fascinating project.
And I would imagine that that means not only efficiency in work, right? Like you show up on the job day one and everybody's like trying to figure out their role and it seems a little cumbersome, but then you become literally like one operating unit at the end of the season. What other changes do you see from, maybe from a, let's call it a metabolic standpoint, or how do they adapt? What do they improve on over the course of a season in doing that work?
It's that those are there's so many projects that I would like to do. And then there's the ones that we have been able to do. A colleague of mine who's retired, Steve Gaskell, who was also the U.S. Nordic combined coach for a number of years, his big interest was in measures of oxygen consumption that you could sustain for long periods of time. So that basically is a deep dive into how fast can you run for 3 miles in a row, or 4 miles, or 6 miles, or 26 miles, or whatever. And it sort of digs into how do you measure that. And so he did that in these fire crews, a pretty decent sample size of hot shots and type 2 crews years ago. And that's where he saw this widespread measure or widespread variability. And then at the end of the season, everybody came together. What that means is the people that show up like as really good runners, pretty decent trail runners, good hikers, doing their weights, they're ready to go, they're over ready in a sense for the job. Unfortunately, they detrain over the course of the season because the job is not hard enough. It's not as hard as some of the training sessions that they've stacked up for the months and months and months before the season. And so I feel for those folks because they're probably enormously satisfied or dissatisfied and frustrated with how slow the pace is, because they are ready to be able to go this slow, but everybody as a whole has to go this slow. because we got to wait for these guys. And the lower fit individuals find themselves migrating upward and developing improved fitness over the course of the season, and to bring everybody to the same metric. And so knowing what that similarity or that same metric is at the end of the season provides a great deal of evidence for mapping the specificity going into the season. So the goal would be to reduce the variability at the outcome, improve the fitness level of the people that are low. And it's not like the people that are high fitness need to stop training. What they need to do is they need to have some mental refocus to recognize that it's okay that they're going to go slower, or that they're going to have to go slower. Yeah. So, but that's the only thing that really changes across the season. In some folks, the vast majority of folks end up detraining in a way that changes their blood levels of lipids, which it sways in the wrong direction. Most of the time they get fatter over the course of the season. Not everybody, but the big studies that we've done where we've measured all that in 100 folks, different hotshot crews, statistically, the group as a whole gets fatter a little bit. The body weight goes up. And so, but which is really odd because of how physical the job is. But you have to think about how physical the job is relative to what they're used to training for.
Well, and my mind obviously goes to and what they're eating,
Yes.
and right. So you are. I think that, and again, this is probably not even my place to speak about this because I don't have near the background you do. But my guess would be the idea is we're doing this tremendous amount of work, so therefore we have the room for kind of eating and doing whatever we want, right? And having had worked with some hot shots and being friends with people who spent kind of the early part of their career being a hot shot, now they're in structural fire or something else. There's not a lot of good stuff sitting around a fire camp, right? It's mostly easy to prepare, very high calorie type foods. And so I think it's a good point to make where yes, it's very physical, but intake versus output is always the great equilibrium, even in something physical like that. And I think it's a good takeaway message for the general population, because our assumption is, oh, well, my metabolism is broken, or it's because I sit in an office all day. And it's like, well, your intake may be lower than a hot shot's, but the great equilibrium is always going to be intake versus outtake. I mean, that is the foundation.
The measures of energy expenditure that we've done with the tracer methodologies have paved the way for identifying what the nutrient demands are, total energy needs are. Every time we've measured the energy intake, as painstakingly as we can, or as detailed as we can, which is hard to do in a human, because they're not accurate and the recipes have to be dissected apart and quantified appropriately. But we've always come up short in the total energy intake relative to the total energy expenditure while they're on the line on a 3 to 7 to 14 day assignment. The measures of, or the estimated measures of energy intake do not match. They're not as high oftentimes on average as the measures of energy expenditure. But it's not a perfect science. The energy intake measures is not a perfect measure for sure. But and then that doesn't account for what happens when they come off the fire line and they head back home for a few days. Their behavior is going to be, well, I never got these foods on the fire line. I'm going to eat a lot of them now. And it's really hard to know, is it all nutritional behavior? So in the review article, we certainly mention this sort of triad of a variety of different factors. So there's sort of this deconditioning arm. There's sort of a nutritional arm that's probably a culprit. But then you have stress and sleep and smoke. And so all these different factors, every single one of them is bad in terms of influencing the health of the individual from preseason to postseason. So it's probably all of those things in some folks. It's one or two of those things in other folks. So it just depends on what the individual brings to the table. If somebody shows up really well trained and then they look fatter at the end of the season, it's probably because they didn't train as hard. The job was way easier than their training. So they just detrained. And so the natural thing is, well, I'm going to get a little bit fatter. And then in other folks are like, oh my gosh, I'm not used to having all this free food. And they just plow through biscuits and gravy in the morning, steak and gravy in the evening, and processed food all day long. And it's hard for them to regulate it appropriately.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I mean, we've talked about this before in other episodes, but one of the hard things with, like you'd mentioned, the processed food and some of the other stuff is that it's good. You don't, like, if you were to sit down to a table full of 60 pounds of apples, you'd probably make it through 3 and you just would be done, right? Because at that point you're full, you're satiated, you just don't want any more. Right. Whereas if you sit down to biscuits and gravy, it's like, oh yeah, I'm full, but this is so good, I'm going back. And so it's very, very, very easy to over consume calories when, a vast majority, call it 80% of your diet, is from foods like that. But what I do love about the team, the team aspect is it does show the value of the team, meaning it brings guys or gals who aren't as well conditioned up, right? There's a standard that everybody's trying to meet, and you want to be an asset instead of a liability. And so there is immense value in, whether it's a group of people just starting their training together and they all feel deconditioned, find a standard that you want to meet, right? And then progressively overload up to that. Or maybe there's a group of folks going on let's say an Alaskan hunt, and one guy's in great shape, but his buddy's maybe not. Well, now, you've got a torch to carry, and your buddy has a torch to look to get up to there. But at the same time, it sounds like the torch carrier needs to find some work on his own too to make sure that he maintains what he has. So I think it's a great takeaway. And as always, I really appreciate you being here and the time, the insight, and everything that you provide. I'll link your professor profile from University of Montana to the show notes. So if anybody's interested in getting a hold of you or checking out more of the stuff that you've got, they can do that there. Any final parting words of wisdom you want to leave?
Oh man, so many. I think the one of the things that, as I've been doing this for so long, you start to reflect on what that's looked like and what that's meant to you. And working with these teams, I mean, we've done so many studies in the lab and out of the lab with a variety of different folks. But man, it's been the coolest part of my whole career to have worked with these fire crews over the years, and just become friends with so many of them. I send emails and messages and questions to different folks across the country all the time as a result of knowing some of these folks for 25 plus years, which is super, super cool, because that eludes most science. And most scientists don't have those relationships with the teams, which I really, really enjoy. But,
well, and they're truly the unsung heroes, right? I mean, there are countless folks who will never get a thank you, yet protected your cabin in the woods somewhere, right? I mean, they are the people that are responsible for making sure that didn't burn down when there's a random lightning strike and a forest fire starts. And I mean, I can think of a few times when I've been out and overnight there's this golden, aura off in the distance of a fire that had started overnight. And sure enough, here comes a crew to come put it out the following day. And so, yeah, a lot of those folks, we will never know who they are. They'll never hear a thanks, but they protect a lot of the resources that we love. So truly a great group of folks.
That's kind of the goal. That was one of my main goals with that big review article, was to just get it on paper and get it into a journal, so that if there is a tactical or a strength and conditioning person that has the opportunity to work with fire, please look at that paper. If you can't get it, send me an email. I'll send it to you. Let that be the backdrop for how you start to script out a training program. If you're a medical professional and you work in an emergency room and you've treated 1 or 2 wildland firefighters because they've overheated or they've got burned on the job or whatever, look at that review article. If you can't get it, email me, I'll send it to you. That way you know what you have, a better appreciation for what their job is all about. That's the goal of that paper. Same with sport nutrition people. They're famous for knowing more than they project onto the folks that they work with. Look at that paper. It provides all the foundation for how to design strategies. And there is no perfect anything. There's no perfect training program. There's no perfect nutritional plan. It has to be trial and error with the real people.
Really appreciate everyone joining. And again, thank you to Dr. Ruby, who invested quite a bit of time with me over a few different podcasts to cover this topic that I was really excited to have him on to cover. We've got a ton of other cool stuff coming this summer leading into the fall, so be sure to subscribe to not miss any of it if you're interested. We are also launching our Fall Foundations Plus group on July the 2nd. So if you're interested in learning more about nutrition, getting some more information that exists beyond just the basics, but maybe you're not quite ready to commit to something like the one-on-one coaching, this might be something you want to check out. If that's the case, you can click on the information in the show notes. It'll take you to the page and give you a bit more idea of what that looks like. And you can also always reach out to me if you have any questions too. I'm happy to help and see if that's a good fit for you. Finally, thank you for all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this show or any other episodes, would you do us a big favor and maybe pass it along to someone else that you think who might be interested in the topic or to enjoy it as well? That, more than anything else, helps us spread great information to other folks who may have the same passions and interests that we do, and we appreciate it. You can email us at info@v2pnutrition.com. If you've got any questions or topics that you would love to hear us cover, we would love to cover those. So feel free to send those over to us. Until then, we will see you back here again in a couple of weeks. Have a good week, everyone.